So just say good evening again, officially, and welcome. This is a special presentation with author Renee Bondy in conversation with theologian and psychotherapist Michael Hryniuk, discussing Renee's book, The Power of Stories to Heal. As my label on my screen suggests, my name's Catherine Peed, and on behalf of lay Catholics, I just want to concern lay Catholics. I want to thank you for joining us this evening. It's lovely to see so many people who care about this topic, who continue to want to understand it and become more aware of this issue in our church and in our society, and how we can respond in supportive and positive ways. So before we begin, I would just like to acknowledge that many of the lands we live, work, and meet on are the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples across this country. As settlers, it's our responsibility to learn about and acknowledge our colonial history and the ways in which we may continue to perpetuate it. As people of faith working for justice, we are called to discern how we are to respond to the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and how we can support Indigenous peoples across this land we know as Canada. Concerned Lay Catholics is an independent group which came together in 2018 in response to the scandal of clergy sexual abuse in our church. A major part of our work since then has been to come to a better understanding of clergy sexual abuse in order to promote healing for survivors and a healthier church culture. So I'll now invite my colleague, Brenda Coleman, who's been with me on this journey from just about the very beginning. And Brenda's going to read CLC's Statement of Solidarity with Clergy Sexual Abuse.
We stand in solidarity with all victims of clergy sexual abuse. We are moved by compassion to reflect deeply on the suffering of our wounded brothers and sisters and to pray for them always. We make a commitment to educate ourselves and others about the devastating impact of this scandal in our church. We promise to promote justice and healing for victims and their families, and for all those injured by this betrayal of our deepest values. We commit ourselves to the transformation of church structures and clerical culture that put protecting the institution above justice for victims and accountability for our offenders. We rely on God in all of this, asking that we be sustained in this commitment we have made.
Thank you, Brenda. This is a painful topic, and we enter into it with a deep sense of humility and gratitude for the courageous spirits we have encountered among the survivors we've been privileged to meet on this journey. Tonight, we ask, please, if the conversation becomes too painful or triggering for you at any point, that you take care of yourself in whatever ways you need to, including taking a break, stepping away, and or reaching out to someone who can offer you support. Just going to make a few points on tonight's format and how we will proceed. So the conversation between Michael and Renee will last for about 45 minutes, followed by an opportunity for questions that will last about 20 minutes. The question and answer will be moderated by Michael directly through the Zoom, and we ask you simply to use the reaction function to raise your hand so that Michael can see who wants to ask a question or make a comment, and he'll attempt to go to everyone in the order in which they raise their hand. So just bear with him, as we identify the order and hopefully honor that order. But if we miss somebody, we'll come back to you. Just again, to remind you to keep your microphone switched off throughout, unless obviously when you're asking a question in the Q&A. The chat function, I'm going to close that during the conversation itself to allow for undistracted viewing and then I'll reopen it for the Q&A. So I would just let you know that we'll be closing the chat now. We're incredibly fortunate to have Renée Bondy with us tonight to share with us her experience writing this book. In Non-Disclosure, a fictionalized account inspired by a true story, Renée seeks to honor the experience of victims, to explore how a community is impacted by the scandal of clergy sexual abuse, and to affirm the power of stories to inform, educate, and challenge readers. Renée is a writer and educator. Over the years, she has written for various journals, including Catholic New Times, Herizons Magazine, and Bearings Online. And her essays have been aired on CBC Radio. Her short stories have been published in Canadian literary journals, including the New Quarterly, Plenitude, Horseshoe, and the Humber Literary Review Spotlight. Renée holds degrees in religious studies and history, including a Ph.D. in Canadian history from the University of Waterloo. She taught in the Women's and Gender Studies program at the University of Windsor for several years, where she facilitated courses on queer activism, women and religion, and the history of women's movements. Renée is a graduate of the Humber School for Writers. When she's not sitting at the keyboard, she's an avid swimmer, baker, cruciverbalist, and hospice volunteer. She and her partner make their home in Chatham, Ontario. Renée is joined tonight in conversation with Michael Hryniuk, Ph.D. Michael is a theologian, educator, spiritual director, and registered psychotherapist with the Institute of Family Living in Toronto. He previously served as Spiritual Care Supervisor with the Catholic Children's Aid Society of Hamilton, Executive Director of the Henri Nouwen Society, and Associate Director of the John Main Center for Meditation and Interreligious Dialogue at Georgetown University. As a Catholic Christian and mental health advocate, Michael remains committed to organizational health in the institutional church and restorative justice for survivors of clerical abuse. He finds joy in exploring contemplative spirituality, flying airplanes, and relaxing on the islands of Greece. Now I'm going to hand it over to Michael and Renée and invite them to share their conversation with us.
Thank you, Kathy. Let me just say a word of thanks also to the organizers of this event and the all of the participants for joining us tonight in this important conversation. I think it was just about 10 years ago when I had started my work at the Catholic Children's Aid. I was in a church basement and I was asked to support a process that Kathy was leading, and that was the first time I met her around dialogue in parishes around clerical sexual abuse. And then I had the privilege of working with Kathy as my associate spiritual care provider. And then I think about a year ago, I had the honor of meeting Renée. And so Renée and I have been in dialogue a little bit over the last year when I'm a member of her family who's a friend of mine said, "Have you heard about this book called Non-Disclosure? It's coming out." And I had not heard of it, and I picked it up and I read it, and right away I knew that this was going to be an important book and something that concerned lay Catholics should be aware of. And that began a conversation about a year ago, I suppose, Renée, between Kathy and CLC and Renée. So this event really is the fruit of that conversation. We just felt that what Renée had done in this book was really important and really worth sharing with our network and our audience. And I want to thank, of course, Renée tonight for being willing to step up and share with us a little bit about some of the topics and the questions and the issues that this book has really surfaced in an important way. So, Renée.
Michael, hi.
The last time we met was on a on a beach in the Grand Bahama Island. And I wanted to really just continue that conversation with you because I think we began to touch already on some of those questions that were close to my heart, close to Kathy's heart, CLC. And I thought it would be helpful to start tonight by offering a little bit of context and a little bit about the story of the story, how this what this book is about, just for folks who haven't obviously read it, but also the genesis of this book and what inspired you to enter into this.
Okay, well, thanks, Michael. And I'm very happy to continue our discussion and to invite others into that discussion. And thanks to Kathy and Brenda and the crew for inviting us. I'm really honored to be here and really always happy to talk about the book, but especially in this context. So the book, it's a short novel. It's written in 4 parts as opposed to in conventional chapters. And in part 1 of the novel, we meet this young woman narrator who reflects on the abuse she suffered in childhood at the hands of a Roman Catholic priest. As the novel moves forward into parts 2, 3, and 4, we meet her again in her 20s. And at this point in her life, she's working in an underground hospice for men dying with HIV/AIDS. And it's in that unusual setting that she begins to feel like she's a part of a community. She finds a community, and that community helps her not only to navigate the trial that she becomes involved in with regard to the sexual abuse, but she also begins to process some of the trauma of her childhood. As Kathy mentioned, the novel was inspired, I would say, in part by a case that happened here in Chatham, Ontario, back in 2006. It was also inspired by other cases. I did a lot of reading while I was writing this novel. I read about other cases. I read fiction on the subject as well. I was really interested in how I might say something about the issue of clergy sexual abuse in the form of a novel. It was something I hadn't done before. So the inspirations were many, I would say, for this book.
Mm-hmm. Now, and you had worked as an academic in women's studies and in history, and also as a journalist with the Catholic New Times as a columnist. So you had, you were comfortable in those genres. What was it that kind of inspired you to approach this as a work of fiction?
Yeah, I wish I had a really great answer for that. I will say that back in 2006, when the trial was underway in Chatham, I wrote 2 columns for the Catholic New Times. One kind of about the language we use in trying to discuss and understand the issue. And another one just sort of reporting on an event in Chatham specifically. And I knew when I had written those that I had a lot more I wanted to say. I wasn't sure what that was, but I knew there was more to say. And many years passed, and it was always in the back of my mind. And then during the COVID-19 pandemic, I had a lot of time on my hands. I think a lot of us did. A lot of us spent a lot of time alone. And I started to think about what I really wanted to write about. And I kept hearing this little voice in the back of my head saying, you want to say something more than the few bits that you'd written about clergy and sexual abuse back in 2006. I should also say, I'm not from Chatham, Ontario originally. and I'm not a victim of abuse myself. But living through that time here in Chatham really, really moved me, and I think affected me in ways that it took me that long to figure out. Um, and I guess, not to be glib about it, but I also have a very small skill set. Words are kind of my thing. And so I knew that that would be, kind of the way I would approach this. I'd never written fiction. I thought I would probably write maybe some long form nonfiction on this, but the pandemic sort of gave me this window into, I don't know, a creative time that I hadn't anticipated. And I began to write, and it began to sound more like fiction than like nonfiction. So that's sort of how the novel came to be.
Okay. And for those of you who haven't had the privilege of reading this yet, it's a very intimate and personal account of the narrator's experience. And as I was reading that the first time, I thought, wow, how did you gain that degree of insight into their experience? And I guess at a more practical level, like, did you have conversations beyond the research and some of the other work you had done? Did you have conversations with victims, and were you talking to people in victim services? I mean, how did you get to that depth?
I years ago, around the time of the trial, certainly I was here in Chatham. I was talking to a few people. Mostly, I just sat with the subject matter, which wasn't easy to do. I walked away from the computer a lot. I kind of feel like writing fiction, especially writing fiction that's written in the first person, with a very close narrator, it involves what some people would say is sort of a radical empathy, that it took a long time and it took a lot of sitting with that narrator to be able to find the words to express her view and her perspective on her experience. So really, I think a lot of reading and a lot of time.
And you were also living in Chatham at the time when the Sylvester trial was taking place. And so you're exploring the impact of clerical abuse and the trials and the I guess the turmoil in the churches. Was that something that you were sort of surprised by, or was that something you definitely wanted to explore?
It was definitely, one of my primary interests in writing about this. I thought back a lot to that time, and I read about a lot of other cases and other communities, and all of the mixed reactions and conversations and the anger and hurt and all of those things on the level of community were really moving to me. And it was something that I really hoped I could find a way to harness and translate somehow.
Yeah, I just want to say for those of you who don't know a lot about and I'm sure many of you do, with the Sylvester case, just at a factual level, that Charles Sylvester, during his time in the priesthood, sexually abused, at least I think in terms of the trial, was 45 or 47 young women. And almost everybody in the Chatham community was impacted, directly or indirectly. And so it created a huge, I think a sort of a huge rift in the community and in families, because so many people were sympathetic to the priest. Some people were outraged at the allegations. So this was a big deal, not just at the individual level, but the trauma affected the whole community, right?
Yeah, it was a big deal, and the abuse took place over 5 decades. So you had generations of people affected by that one perpetrator.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that had a big impact as well.
Mm-hmm. This was Father Charlie, who had married many of the couples and had baptized their children, and was like an integral part of that community. So it was a huge betrayal of trust and so on. Now, the other thing in the afterword of this book, where you kind of spell out some of your motives for writing this, you talk about the importance of giving voice to young women, to girls and young women, because a lot of the literature around clerical sexual abuse really focuses on young men and the priests. Can you say more about what inspired that? Like, and what in particular about their experience did you want to lift up?
Yeah, I think what inspired it is, as a writer and as a reader, I was really interested in how people had written on the subject in the past. And it tended to be the case, at least in the wide reading that I did, that fiction writers tended to write on the subject about male victims and male perpetrators, obviously, priests. And female victims tended to be underrepresented in fictional accounts. And I was thinking that there was a space for this story in that way. Also, I thought that there's a particular set of values that young girls, I think, in Catholicism are encouraged to embody, things like obedience and virginity and passivity and piety. And those are also values, I think, that boys are encouraged to adopt, but not to the same degree and not in the same way. And I really wanted to kind of unpack that a little bit in this story, to frame girlhood in a particular way that, I don't know, it rang true for me. I hope it would ring true for readers as well. And
Yeah.
I think it says something about the particular kind of grooming and abuse that happens with young women.
Yeah, I would love if you could say a little bit more about that, because you really do, you sort of paint that portrait very delicately but very powerfully in the book. It's the I guess the sort of the piety and the passivity and the yes father, no father, not just of the girls, but their families and the church as a community. This kind of, I mean, sort of patriarchal, from the hierarchy certainly, but also we're complicit. We're accommodating that in that time, in that church, in that culture.
Mm-hmm.
Can you say more about what you were kind of exploring there?
Again, a particular, set of values and a particular, I think, set of models for young girls,
Mm-hmm.
the idea of these pious, silent women and maybe women who weren't like that way back when in history, but who are presented that way
Mm-hmm.
in the culture of the church. And that girls are taught to aspire to that and to learn from these models in ways that I don't think are always helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, to say the least.
Yeah.
Do you think there's been a shift in terms of what you've observed? So this was kind of set in the 80s, right?
Yeah. The novel, begins in the early 1970s and ends, I think, in the mid to late 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what to say about the present because I don't have children and I didn't teach young children, and I don't really know if those same models and same behavioral expectations apply today. I don't know what to think about that. Maybe you have a better idea of that than I do.
I'm not sure. But I'm sure that there are people in the audience tonight
Yes.
who may want to weigh in on that. And
Yes.
in terms of the shifts in the way that we
Mhm.
I'm speaking generally, but the way that women, I think, have
Yeah.
expressed their faith in the church from that era to this one.
Mhm.
I'm sure there are people here who could comment on that.
Yeah.
Well, I know that's been an important element, or in terms of the motivation, and of course the impact on the community. I'm also kind of, I guess I want to get right to the title, which really is about disclosure and non-disclosure,
Mhm.
because I think in terms of the broader experience of this young woman, what is I think very core to her struggle isn't just the effect of the abuse and the trauma related to that, but it's the secret, right? And I I think that what I noticed is, and this is the way I would frame it, is that there's a double bind here that you're kind of working with. That disclosure, non-disclosure, is a very painful way of being for her, and then in the act of disclosure, it's also painful because of the impact it has on her parents, her family, and then of course in the community. And so I'm just wondering if you could help us understand more about what you were doing, what you were getting at with this struggle between the healing part of disclosure, but also the wounding.
Yeah. I think that's something I really had to think a lot about, and something I learned a lot about in writing this. It was an understanding that sort of evolved as I was writing. And I kept thinking about the ways in which secrets and secrecy and silence can be both damaging and protective.
Mhm.
Certainly, I think when silence is imposed, it can do terrible things. It can limit healing, it reinforces shame and fear, and it certainly protects perpetrators. I think in a lot of ways it can be very harmful. But there are also ways in which secrecy can be protective, right? And we've been talking a lot about the narrator of the novel and her dealing with the sexual abuse that she experienced in childhood. But sort of the other element of this novel is about this hospice for men with AIDS. And it was in that section of the novel that I really began to think about how protective silence could be. This is fictional, of course, but in the 1980s, we know that this is the very early years of the AIDS epidemic, and men who were dying with AIDS were subject to all sorts of fear and discrimination and misinformation in the public. And the secrecy around this hospice in the story, their reluctance to disclose their HIV status, had a lot to do with the protective value of secrecy. And I think that was an important thing for me to think through in writing about that. And, we all know that who tells and when is really, really important, right?
Absolutely. And as a therapist, dealing with cases of abuse, secrecy has actually helped people survive.
Mm-hmm.
In psychologically and socially, but there is a point, and this is where I'm going to invite Renee to read a little bit of her novel, because I think that little section at the end of the first that little part at the end of the first section where you kind of have a meditation on secrecy and disclosure and non-disclosure. I think that really contains something of the soul of this book. So yeah, would you open that up for us a little bit? And I'd like people to hear your voice and hear some of the
Sure.
text itself.
Sure. I should say that the novel is written in a fairly conventional first-person narrative, but there are these little reflective pieces sort of scattered throughout. And as I said, I really had to think a lot about secrets and secrecy, and this is sort of the result of that.
Hmm.
A secret is a mustard seed, a tiny speck with the potential to grow 1,000,000 times its size. Clench it in your fist and never let it see the light. Feel it quiver with potential energy like a Mexican jumping bean. A secret is a little red firecracker, the kind children are told never to carry in their pockets. See the burns on that boy? He was playing with firecrackers. Secrets are like that. The tiniest spark, and it's game over. They are compact blasting caps, which, if detonated, can bring down a 50-story building. Pause to imagine the latent possibility. A secret is powerful, yet invisible, like a germ. Scientists discovered the bacteria that caused the Black Plague, a medieval secret that wiped out 1/3 of the population. That they still exist is no surprise. People are mortal, but secrets are eternal. A secret is a life sentence, a permanent gag order, more effective than duct tape across the mouth. People who keep secrets are hog-tied, immobilized. A secret is a straitjacket laced with chains. When Houdini asked to be submerged in a tank of water, sorry, my page is stuck. When Houdini asked to be submerged in a tank of water, it wasn't to make his escape more difficult, but to quiet the screaming of his skin. A secret is a suit of armor, like chainmail under your clothes. It weighs you down and keeps you safe. Wear it like a bulletproof vest. If the words are not said aloud, you will be protected and impervious to doubt, ridicule, and worse, pity. If you keep the secret, it will stay contained and containable. It is impossible to say what will happen if it gets out. The Pandora's box hidden under your bed is full of terrible knowledge that will change everything. Still your trembling hands. Seal the lid with tape and elastic bands and place it in the bottom of the trash can. Secrets can be kept so long that silence becomes second nature. Close your mouth and your mind. Seal them off with paraffin wax, the seal of the confessional. Keep the secret, even from yourself. Dress in the dark. Camouflage yourself in oversized hoodies and black yoga pants. Play music so loudly your body vibrates. When you are able to sleep, bury your head under your pillow and clench your teeth. Telling will change how you see and are seen, will define you in ways you cannot predict and do not recognize. No one likes a tattletale, a snitch, a rat. Whispered confessions will require new words, cleanly enunciated vulgar verbs. If you dare, tell just one person, that person who will never ever repeat what you say. Barely whisper it, just mouth the words. This thing happened to me. I was 4 or 6 or 8. It just kept happening. I couldn't stop it. I didn't know how. It was so messed up. I was so messed up. When you confide in that one person, you will be flayed and lifted up at the same time. Tell until there is nothing left, not words, not anger, not breath. Tell everything. Scream until you lose your voice or your mind. When you finally inhale, it will be like your first infant breath. Lie on your back and stare at the ceiling. Feel the air in your lungs and think, okay, okay. Telling is an end and a beginning.
Thank you so much. I just want to take a moment to let that settle and sink in because it's so important to this book and the story that you're telling. It's kind of a turning point. So it's a very intimate and personal account of her struggle to come to release this, the secret. And you move slowly as she ages into teen and into her later teen years after she's graduated from high school. I guess with the whole journey of releasing the secret, and she does this in a very unique way. And just for the sake of the audience, as Renee mentioned, it's her redemption, or the beginning of her redemption and her healing and the revealing of the secret, is in her service to men who are dying of AIDS in a hospice that she herself creates. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about how that happens for her. How is it that the revelation, where she feels safety and almost solidarity in the suffering of these men, it sort of liberates her to begin to open up that part of herself. Like, what's happening there with her in the service of these men? How is it a healing experience?
Yeah. I think, on a very basic level, I think she sees herself in the silent suffering of the men that she serves. She's very unlike them in many ways, but she has great empathy for the way their stories are silenced, the way they're unable to speak, whether it's to their families or their communities. And she understands that on a very personal level. I think also it's the act of service. It's the day to day. It's not pretty dealing with people who are ill and dying, and she immerses herself in that, and she learns a lot from the nurses and the other volunteers about what it means to really serve others. And she enters into this process where, sort of through serving others, she's also kind of healing herself. That giving and receiving are two sides of the same coin. And I think that's kind of a really important moment for her when she comes to see that. And there's the community of the men in the hospice. There are the other people who work at the hospice. She finds a support group outside of the hospice. Once she finds a community, she sort of grows into these other communities as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a beautiful account of her beginning. As you said in that section, it's the end, but it's the beginning of the healing, and the opening and the revelation of her own suffering, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then eventually I think she lives into a new identity in relationship to these men, but also to herself. I would say sort of agency, that she's recovering her sense of identity and agency and power to affect her own life. Right? In the conversation that you and I had a few weeks ago, and in this, you've just recently written a piece. What's the name of the journal that it's just been released in? I can't remember.
For Poets and Writers magazine.
Okay. On the responsibility of the writer.
Mm.
And in our conversation and in that piece, you're talking about trust, and you're talking about the challenge that we face, not just as writers, but generally, in holding these disclosures.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about what you've learned, in a sense, about, because you were telling me that as a result of this book, many people have come forward with their own disclosures to you personally.
Yeah. And I suppose I was sort of naive about that. When you write a book, you're by yourself a lot, and it's just you and the screen. And um, when the book went out into the world, a lot of people contacted me and shared their stories, and it was very humbling and also very overwhelming. It's affirming in that, I obviously struck a chord with some people, and the story was told in such a way that people felt comfortable telling me their stories. It took me a while to figure out what to do with that, and to realize I didn't really have to do anything with it, but to see sort of the gift of that, and to meet folks who are kind of at a place where they're able to share their stories, and to sort of honor that with them has been a really profound experience. If we can find the link to that article, we'll send it to CLC.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of people would appreciate reading what you've said there. I mean, just to pursue a little bit more. So we're talking about the power of stories to heal.
Mm-hmm.
And clearly your story resonated with a lot of people who have suffered. And I'm wondering if you've had any thoughts or reflections on how that story has touched them, or been a source of healing for them. Is it just the act of sharing, the catharsis, the release of the story to you, or what do you think is happening there?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I fully understand that. You might have a better way of thinking about that than I do. You might have better language to apply to that. I don't see myself as an expert in any way. Um, and I also realize that a work of fiction isn't going to necessarily change the world, but I hope it invites conversations.
Mhm.
One of my favorite writers is a writer named Sigrid Nunez, and she said, I'm going to misquote her, I think, but something like, um, if every poet in the world wrote a poem about a tree, it wouldn't do anything to slow climate change.
Mhm.
And when I read that, I thought, oh, okay. Like, and it kind of brings you down to earth. Writing fiction doesn't change the world in a very direct way, but you hope that it invites conversations.
Mhm.
It's kind of that changing hearts and minds thing that you hope happens.
Yeah, I think it is hard to capture what exactly that power of a story like this is, but I certainly and at this point, let me just encourage people to take time with this story, because for me personally, it was very evocative, and it took me as a person, but also as a professional, into the depths of this experience. And I think it does change. Even those of us who've worked in the field for many years, it awakens a certain consciousness or level of consciousness, and as you say, a sense of connection to the suffering of folks who've been through this.
Yeah.
So
And,
compassion.
and also, I wanted the book to end on a hopeful note. I know not
Mhm.
everyone's story ends on a hopeful note, but I wanted this young woman to, I wanted us to leave her in a place where we felt like she was beginning to come to terms with her past.
Mhm.
It doesn't have a happily ever after sort of ending by any means, but it was important to me that it approach a place of hope.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I want to get to hope in a minute in a kind of a larger way, but um, the third thing that you mentioned in the afterword is, and it's related to this raising of consciousness, and that's your concern for justice,
Mhm.
and something that you care about, and I'm sure everybody here cares about. And I wonder, you've worked as a historian and as a columnist and now as an author. It seems that this was also meant to inspire critical reflection and dialogue and raising of consciousness. I mean, I, I kind of asked you this a few weeks ago, but I wonder if I could ask you again, like, when you look at the larger picture of what the clerical abuse scandal revealed about the culture of the church and clericalism, and patriarchy, what did you ponder, or could you ponder out loud a little bit about where you see some of the root causes of this, and what we need to be addressing?
Well, yeah, that's a really big question. I think
Yeah.
that's what I said last time you asked me that,
Yeah.
Michael. That's a really big question. And I'm not an expert. And I think for me anyway, especially doing research to write this, on a case-by-case basis and sort of looking at, individual cases that have happened over many, many, many decades. It's on one level, you're saying, okay, well, the church needs to stop covering up for its priests who are criminals. It needs to embrace policies of transparency. It needs to work with the court system. We can say all of those, sort of practical things. But to me, it's the larger systemic issues that I really grapple with, and that I think are so complicated. Like you mentioned, if you structure an institution with a patriarchal, hierarchical model of leadership, is that ever going to result in real meaningful dialogue and change? I'm skeptical. I don't know how others feel about that. I think part of a hope for solution to me is that I think a lot of people are beginning to see the ways in which clerical sexual abuse and the church's history with Indigenous peoples and their attitudes toward queer folks and their attitudes toward women are really all part of the same larger issue. And, until the people around the table, the decision-making table, change, until that composition changes, I don't know how optimistic I feel personally, but it's certainly something that I think about and watch.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you know, I mean, we've started this initiative of Walking with Survivors, where we're grappling with how to hold space for dialogue and accompanying survivors personally, but also engaging survivors in conversation around what their needs are in
Mm-hmm.
the church, and particularly from church leadership and in the hierarchy. And I'm it's a slow process, but I guess what I'm hearing in your response, and I'm also hearing in the book, is there's one in particular section where I'll say this parenthetically, where the victim and her parents visit the bishop, and I can't resist. I just want to read a little bit of this part here because I think it speaks to the issue of power and how power is used. And you write, at the end of the meeting, my parents signed some papers, told them, and the bishop said, "This is standard for your daughter's protection. This matter will be handled confidentially, and then you can put it behind you. The financial compensation is for your time and distress. It should never have come to this." And as we were leaving, and this is one of these little details, my parents shook the bishop's hand. We drove home in silence, and my parents stared straight ahead. And I asked myself, why did I tell? I knew it had been a mistake. I felt that I had committed a horrible sin, that I'd unleashed a contagion that had infected us all. There was no absolution for this confession to balm for my guilt, but this sense of being marginalized by the power of this office, and because I know you've reflected on power in the course of your career, so Do you see power as being the issue?
Certainly an important part of the issue. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, that's because we're trying to discern how to engage the powers
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
principalities, as it were.
Mhm.
Um, so finally, you did mention that there's there's hope at the end. This young woman decides to break bust loose after her work in the hospice, and she decides to begin writing herself and become a journalist. And um, I'm wondering where you're seeing where you're seeing hope for the survivors. Like, what is it that we can do in our solidarity with you and with them to offer hope? Because this is a very hopeful book in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, Hope is complicated, isn't it?
Yeah.
I guess a lot of things are complicated, but hope in particular, hope is one of those things, it's we kind of hold it up like a beacon, we sort of aspire toward being hopeful, and there's nothing wrong with that. Um, I think hope, obviously helps people endure. It gives people purpose. It moves people forward. Hope is really important, but I think there's a way in which hope can also kind of be a burden, right? Like hope, if if you're supposed to have hope, but you're not feeling hope, that's a lot of pressure to put on a person. And hope comes with disappointment often. We set ourselves up to be very hopeful and then we're disappointed. So I think hope is one of those things that, at least to me, is sort of a bit of a balancing act, right?
Mhm.
And it doesn't, I don't mean to say that I'm not hopeful and that people shouldn't be hopeful, but I think um, holding hope up as something to which others should aspire is sometimes kind of daunting. I find it kind of daunting.
Mhm.
So that's what I've been thinking about hope. I think, there's another book in that or something, really.
Yeah, I know hope is complicated.
Hope is
Yeah.
complicated.
Well, I have one final question, and I
Okay.
hope this one's a soft pitch.
Okay.
But, in telling this story, how have you been touched? How have you changed? This has been a labor of love, and I'm
Yeah.
wondering from sort of day one to today, how this experience of the writing and the telling and the disclosure, in a sense, has changed you or touched you as a person, even healed you.
Yeah, I spent many, many hours sort of immersing myself in this subject. And as someone who, as I mentioned earlier, is not a victim of abuse, it it made me, if not more empathetic, then certainly more attuned, more invested, I guess,
Mhm.
in the subject matter. And it also, I think, reinforced for me that fiction makes a difference, that art makes a difference, and that the time invested by writers and by readers is really, really important.
Mhm.
Um, I, yeah, I think I could go on and on, but I think that's all I want to say about that.
Well, we'll keep that conversation going for another
For
time,
sure.
but I know that it can't have not touched and changed you to have gone through
Mhm.
that process.
Yeah.
So I wanted to give you an opportunity to speak to that.
Mhm.
And I want to thank you. I mean, just for all that you've shared tonight around this, just in this part of the conversation, because I think what I hope is that it's kind of stirred people up and that they have their own thoughts and feelings and questions. Um, and at this point, I want to invite others into the conversation with Renee, and I'm going to do my best on the gallery review to entertain questions to Renee as people feel moved. And Kathy's going to open up the chat and help keep me on track here with anyone who wants to. Please raise your hand with the it's called the reaction set there, if you know how to use that, just so I can see where you are. And while we're waiting, I always want to leave a pause because people need time sometimes to formulate a question. What are some of the other questions that you're hearing or are being asked, or maybe some of the reaction that you've had to this book?
Yeah, a lot of people have asked if I'm going to write more on this subject, and I would say no at this point. That I've been writing a lot of other things, which has been a good change. But I should never say never because it could come back around.
Kellyanne, please.
Thank you. I just wanted to share something. I have read Renee's book and had conversations with her. I just wanted to share with the group what I wrote to her about after reading her story. I think some of you might find it helpful. Thank you for sharing with the world the unspoken feelings and fears that were a part of my childhood and the childhood of too many other little girls. You have given a voice to so many who had no voice. I want to thank you for the compassion, empathy, and care with which you told this story. You have honored all of the children who are victimized by priests and by the church.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd second the motion. Yeah, I'd echo that very much. Christine.
Well, I'm happy I can actually speak because I thought I was going to be stuck in the library tonight, but I skipped home. So regarding the power of stories to heal, I went through a pretty rough spot with some experiences in the church, and not too long after that, took a course called the Catholic Literary Imagination, which of course dealt with many of the things that I had seen and experienced. I wasn't allowed to talk about those things, but I could talk about the characters in the book. And because when you write a story in a book, you can get inside people's heads and inside their thinking, and you can really grapple with who these people are, these people that are harmful, these people that are struggling, people that are, just all the complexities of human beings. And I did read your book, and I thought it was a wonderful contribution to this, telling stories that can give us a place to be able to enter into things on an emotional level, and also talk about them by talking about characters that maybe we can't talk about the real characters, but we can talk about the fictional characters. And I think this person is blah 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 blah, and you don't have to necessarily. It gives you like a buffer to talk about things that if you talk about the actual situation that you've lived, you it's too hard, you're not ready for it, or maybe you're not allowed because maybe you had to sign an NDA. So books are, and telling stories that are fictional, but that are also deeply true and real, so important. So I just wanted to tell you how important that was in my life, but also, and I'm sure that's true for other people, but also just thank you for being part of that process of providing a place for people to talk about a story that is their story, but they don't have to say it is.
Yeah, I like the way you put it, that you can get inside people's heads a bit, that it gives you this vantage point to think other people's thoughts for a moment, and to empathize in a way that it's difficult to do sometimes in the real world. I appreciate you kind of drawing that out a little bit about the story.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Christine. And Robert, I have your hand up there. This is actually sequencing people in order, so please go ahead.
Yeah. Renee, Michael, thank you very much for being here. And dear Catherine and Brenda, good to see you again. I am a survivor of clerical sexual abuse. I have not read your book. I look forward to reading your book. There's some elements to the book that I'm interested to read what it's saying. and what my reality and my reaction is.
Mm.
A couple of things that you pointed that I think are important that I wanted to share here. The secrets that you were talking about. I work with a lot of men who have been in this situation. Because of my situation, I've been able to start a little organization that is doing some work with men and women who have been sexually abused, not only by priests, but in people in positions of power. And that whole power element within the Catholic Church and within the priests and this issue of abuse is huge. It is huge. But the secret for me, not being able to tell anybody, because who's going to believe me over God, is the way that I phrased it. And I went from the age of 11 to the age of 58 63 actually, before I ever discussed it. And then those things that happen because you're keeping that secret, and how sick we become thinking we're normal. And it's not even in our conscious thought all the time. It is just, now we dig it down so deep and we put so much stuff on top of it. And I can only speak from the male perspective. I can't speak from the female perspective, but from what I've learned, they're not far off in the reactionary standpoint. And with myself, it took me into addiction. It took me into failed relationships and marriages. It took me into living on the street. It took me into homelessness. It took me into a number of different things. And out of that, I do have hope today. And the hope and what has to happen as the next step here is, I have to say, what is it I have to do to heal? And survivors don't know what that language is, has been my experience. And I am so happy that, Renee, you've taken the time to dig into this one, especially the Chatham. I know Peter Jaffe, who was heavily involved in that particular case, and a couple of other lawyers who were, because of the work I'm doing. And I really want to honor you in the words that you put together in this book. And I will be getting it, and I will be reading it. And I'll actually get it and read it. I won't just get it on Audible if it's available, because I know I'm going to be making some notes. But there is hope there, and there is healing there that can happen. I have healed because of the abuse, but I still haven't healed with my relationship with the institution I call the Catholic Church. And I won't take up time as to why, but it's very specific, it's very precise, and it's very clear cut. Why I can forgive the priest who abused me. And I have gone to his grave and forgiven him, written a letter and read it to them, and also did a step 9 amend that is done in a 12-step program, which is very anonymous, so I can't mention it here. But it was the forgiveness that healed me and freed me from him living in my head. And I think survivors really have a hard time in that forgiveness component. And for me, that was the biggest thing that can give hope. And I don't know if there was an element of your book where you looked at forgiveness and how it worked for this character within your book, and your main character in the novel, and how she came out to it. But I look forward to reading it, and if I may, I would love the opportunity of maybe discussing it with you after I've done my homework and read the book. But I thank you very much for taking the time and raising your voice with ours as survivors. Catherine and Brenda are just fantastic to walk the path with, and I love them deeply. And I look forward to maybe having some other conversations, because I think there's some more that I can learn as a survivor with the language that is out there and how we now have this conversation. I've had the privilege of meeting some people on the screen here. And how do we have that conversation? Because sometimes I don't know the language. I don't know what it is. When you ask me, what can you do? Sometimes I struggle with being clear and being able to say that specifically, because there's still a lot in there that I don't know will ever come out. So thank you very much. And I guess that wasn't so much of a question, but a comment.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
That's it really, it's very meaningful for me to hear from people who are at different points on their journey. You said, I don't know if the character in your book has, if you deal with the topic of forgiveness, and obviously that's been very meaningful to you. We leave her at the end of the book in her 20s. I was not very together in my 20s, so I kind of left her in a similar state in her 20s. So, but we're optimistic for her. So hopefully she finds that space one day.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Robert, for sharing as a survivor and that struggle. I'd love to say more as a therapist, but I'm going to restrain myself. But I do want to lift up something that has been very much at the forefront of our thinking and reflection around clerical sexual abuse, and that's spiritual abuse. And the fact that the perpetrators are always men representing God and representing this church, and how there's a layer of suffering that is even over the violation of one's body. It's the violation of one's faith and one's spirit and soul, because we place our hope and our faith in these people and this institution, and then it's betrayed so deeply. And so that would be a whole other level or layer of conversation, is how to contend with the spiritual side of this, which I think Renee does indirectly in the hospice work, in the hospice things. But thank you for sharing that element, because that's a big one. Yeah. Michelle, I think, was up next.
Good evening, everyone. I'm really grateful that I was able to be here tonight. I'm grateful to you, Michael and Renee, for offering so much that speaks to my heart. And I'm so grateful for this organization, Concerned Lay Catholics. I was away from the church for 20 years. After I started coming to terms with the fact that after I disclosed that I had been sexually abused by a priest as a very young nun in the mid-70s. I've got tears in my eyes, because a talk like this, it stirs up a lot of stuff. And, and I recognize, I still have unhealed layers. Not that I'm consciously working on that healing, but I think I'm profoundly moved just by knowing the desire of all of you in this organization to stand in solidarity with us survivors who very much feel alone. That was my experience after disclosing. Everyone, the congregation, wanted to cover it up and pretend like it never happened. The major superior of this Jesuit in Spain laughed it off and said, "What's the big deal?" And it just goes on and on and on. And so it's, for me personally, and I think for all of us who are survivors, it's just such a gift to know that there are other Catholics out there who care deeply and who are willing to stand with us and who want to be of service to us, and offer a healing balm to our wounds, however they may show up. I know after Pope Francis in 2019 acknowledged he was in a scrum on a plane on his way back from Africa somewhere, that there were, there were nuns being abused by priests and bishops. I just wanted to go like this. And it's not, him saying that isn't going to amount to anything. But another friend said to me, "Did you hear?" And I really started to dig into all of the stuff that was out there, people telling their stories. And yeah, it's very overwhelming. And I think the whole power thing is certainly very central. And I think the church needs a huge conversion. The hierarchy needs to embrace a way of humility. And I personally think that we should be praying every Sunday for all the people who have suffered at the hands of the clergy, the clerical structure in the church. And Renee, you were mentioning a number of them, the Indigenous people, LGBTQ people, survivors of clergy abuse. We could go on and on, I think. But, I think we should be praying for the church out loud every Sunday and praying for those who have suffered, just so that consciousness becomes more. We're reminded over and over that we have an imperfect church, because it's too easy to forget that, accountability is so important, and taking responsibility for what has happened. I mean, people's lives have been shattered, and it's not enough just to glibly say I'm sorry or write a check or whatever. So, Renee, hopefully I will be able to read your book. I love the discussion that Michael, you, and Renee had. And I think, just being heard and taken seriously. I was reminded actually of, there's an amazing, Christine, you mentioned about the power of fiction. It's fiction, but it's still very powerful and can really address very serious and important issues. And it reminded me of a book by an Augustinian priest called The Black Wall of Silence. This Augustinian priest is gay, and he's written a book of fiction, but he shows up in the book quite a bit because it gives him a way of sharing his experiences without actually saying, these were my experiences. But I found that book really, really powerful. The Black Wall of Silence. And he's written another book, Why, as a Catholic Priest who's gay, he stays in the church. And I think I have his name written somewhere, but if any of you are interested, I think The Black Wall of Silence, because that's certainly been my experience as a lesbian woman. The priest that abused me, I went to see him in great fear and trembling, terrified that I was a lesbian. This was back in the 70s. And and we all know the church still has a heck of a long way to go in welcoming. And I find the church in Canada particularly way behind. The things that are happening in Italy for LGBTQ people is phenomenal. I just read something. Of course, the bishops in Italy have come out and basically said they fully embrace LGBTQ people. So, but they've been praying. There's a couple groups in Italy that every month or something, they have public prayers for LGBTQ people. So I think that those public and open and audible expressions can really bear fruit. So again, thank you. So grateful to be here and grateful for all of you for being here too.
Thank you for sharing that. That was very interesting, and I will definitely look for that book. I'm very curious.
Yes, thank you, Michelle, for your vulnerability and the sharing of that part of your story. There's so much there in terms of the conversion of the church, so to speak. I wish that were the case too, that people were praying audibly every Sunday for all those intentions. We have one last person. I think Ruth Ann Ingram had her hand up, and I wanted to give her a chance, and we'll wrap this up very shortly.
Thank you. I'm out of words for Renee, for Michael, for Catherine for pulling this together. Michelle and Robert, for your courage in speaking. As I was listening and trying to absorb so much, and Renee, this may become, it's more of a comment than a question, but it may be, perhaps it's a suggestion for your next book. As I was sitting back, I also was away from practicing my faith for a long time. I lived in Chatham, and we all knew the stories, and we all knew the pseudonym that was given to one of the priest, was kind of probably the main focus of the Chatham theme. And when I lived in that community, everyone knew. Everyone knew. And I now live in Sudbury, and we've had our challenges here too, and everyone knew. And it brought me back to, just because it was the Yom Shoah a couple of days ago in Israel, and they had to close the Bad Yashim because of the war. I think we as laity, and this is not to diminish the role of the clergy in the hierarchy and the cover-ups, but we, the laity, were also and still are part of the church, those of us, whether practicing or not. And we were there. It's not like the residential schools, and that's a whole other story, where some Canadians could honestly say, we didn't know, because they weren't in those areas. They weren't close. They weren't close to those flying communities. But I think we as laity also share some of the shame and the guilt and the responsibility for restitution, because we were silent. We can't just point the fingers up the food chain, because as Catholics, we are also part of that food chain. And yes, there's a risk in speaking out. There's a huge risk, is it being silenced by the bishop? We've seen that with politicians over the years. One was a gentleman I knew in Windsor who voted in favor of same-sex marriage, and was basically removed from all the roles he had in ministry in the church. But he had the courage to do that. So I think also, in support of all who've been victims of abuse, that I don't know how we look at ourselves, but also acknowledge our responsibility in this. Because you can't just say, well, it was just Hitler. We didn't know about the concentration camps. And we can't just say, oh, it was the clergy. We didn't know about it, because people did. I heard it. And thank you for the gift of this time, even though I went in a circle and it was less of a question, but thank you all.
Yeah,
Thank you for sharing. Renee, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, I really appreciate you raising that aspect of sort of the larger community responsibility. It really speaks to, I think, the power of authority to silence people. That doesn't, I don't think, abdicate people of responsibility, but it really says a lot about the power of an institution to control people's behavior and speech. That's really interesting. I have to think more about that.
Yeah. And I wanted to add just thank you, Ruth Ann, for bringing that up, because I think feel the weight of we feel the weight of the suffering of victims, but it's also, I think, important to feel the weight of our own, in some sense, complicity. Maybe not
Mhm.
directly, not personally, but as concerned lay Catholics. I think we're stepping up now into a greater level of responsibility and awareness of, what happens when we don't speak up. And so I think it's a great reminder, very much in keeping with the mission of this group. Well, I want to
Thank
again
you.
say thank you before I pass this back to Kathy, and just to thank Renee. First of all, thank all of you for your questions, your comments, especially our survivors. I want to encourage you to read the book. As a just personally, I think it's, as a reader, it's a very profound treatment of a very difficult and delicate topic. And as a clinician, it's kind of remarkable how um, how how delicate and uh, skillfully Renee's handled some of the aspects of the pain that survivors go through in terms of shame and isolation and even dissociation. So for those of you who might be clinicians, I would highly recommend the work, just to understand some of the nuances of that. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague and friend Kathy to bring us into a landing here.
Thank you, Michael. To use your aviation metaphors. Kellyanne, I just saw your hand came up at the end, and I wondered if you wanted to make a parting, like a final comment. I don't want anybody to leave not having spoken if they wish to.
No, I just was going back to what Ruth Ann has said. And as a survivor after the fact in Chatham, I was shocked at the number of lay people, teachers, principals, who knew exactly what was going on and who never said anything, and priests who confided in me that they had known what was going on and did nothing. So just, that was a really important point, Ruth Ann, and thank you for bringing it up.
Thank you. And in many ways, that was the impetus for us starting Concerned Lay Catholics. We didn't hear anything from the pulpit. We were getting that silence that Renee talked about, that ability to get people not to talk about things. But among ourselves, we knew people were concerned, and they needed to respond somehow. And I heard one survivor at a conference I attended who said, do lay people think of us as their brothers and sisters? Do they even pray for us? And that really was a turning point for us in terms of our focus, was recognizing that isolation, that loneliness that Michelle talked about, that sense that you were forgotten, you were embarrassing, you were a problem for the rest of us. And we just thought, you're not a problem. We just need to change that. So I appreciate your sharing that, Kellyanne, because and Ruth Ann bringing it up. There's different levels of knowing, and as Renee said, people are afraid to speak up in case, maybe I'm just being, suspicious or whatever. But at the end of the day, you're protecting those in power. So anyway, on that note, I just want to wrap it up. I just want to say again, on behalf of everybody here, a profound thank you to Renee and Michael. Maya Angelou, the American poet, in her book, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, says, there is no greater agony than bearing an untold story within you. And tonight we've had the privilege of hearing someone who understands this truth perhaps more than most. Renee, by facilitating the expression of the untold story of so many, you have offered a powerful and healing gift not only to victim survivors, but to all of us. So thank you for your courage in listening to your muse and channeling a voice whose story cried out to be told. And Michael, your probing yet sensitive questions, and I've experienced this for a number of years now, and I just love it. You assisted all of us to enter into Renee's process and emotional landscape as she brought this story to life. Your skills as a therapist and spiritual guide were much in evidence tonight, and we're deeply grateful you shared them with us. So thank you. I mentioned at the beginning, we've been on this journey since 2018, and over that time, in addition to meeting and walking with survivors, we've been looking for ways to engage the church's leadership to respond in more helpful pastoral ways to the needs of survivors. So we're encouraged to share that we are conducting a pilot project in 3 adjoining dioceses, St. Catharines, Hamilton, and London, with the agreement of the bishops of those dioceses. The pilot is designed to test out a process for facilitating better communication between the bishops and the survivors who live in their dioceses. We're working with some survivors and an advisory committee, some of whom are on the webinar tonight, including our conference moderator, Michael, our conversation moderator, Michael. He's on our advisory committee. So I want to thank everyone who's helping us with the pilot, but I also want to invite anyone who is interested in learning more about it. If you're a survivor or a family member, or you know a survivor or family member of a survivor who lives in one of these 3 dioceses and might be interested in learning more, please be in touch with us or pass this information along. I'm going to put the confidential email address we've created in the chat here. This email address goes only to Brenda Coleman, so nobody else in CLC or in our group sees this, so you can contact Brenda confidentially. I'll put this in the, when I send the email out with the recording link, I'll also add this because there's no obligation. It might be an exploratory conversation with Brenda, and then you'll say, this isn't for me, but it may be something you would be interested in walking with us through. It's a very iterative process where we have some ideas about how we want to proceed. We've talked to the bishops about this. They have indicated an openness to hearing what we come back with. In good faith, we're trusting that where they can, they will do what will help survivors. If that's something that might interest you just to learn more about, and you live in one of those 3 dioceses, please be in touch through this confidential email address. So that's it. Thank you again for being here tonight. Our prayer continues to be for lay Catholics everywhere to come together, to learn together, to pray together, and to act together for healing, reconciliation, and transformation in our church and in our world. Please enjoy the rest of your week and have a very good night. Thank you so much.